Hey, welcome to Unlatched Mind. This is Vinny. My guest today is Cody Kommers. Cody is a UCLA grad. He graduated UCLA with a cognitive science degree. Cody's given talks at Brown University, New York University, Harvard, Boston U. He also spent a couple of years managing the Computational Cognitive Neuroscience lab at Harvard. And he has a bunch of writings online. He has a bunch of blogs. He does a lot of work online. At least I'm sure he has a lot more than I've even seen. But a lot of what I saw from him is really interesting. So the one thing that caught my eye that led me to Cody was one of his blog he had written called The Bimodal Centrist. And it was a really interesting article that really, first of all, defined what a centrist was. And it touched a little bit of politics, but we really didn't make the conversation go there for too long at any one given time. At least I don't think we did. But we dispelled some of the myths of what centrism is and why it's such a bad word in the political arena, and why, for example, centrists have just a bad name, and it's almost like a myth that they're always considered folks that just won't make a decision. When in fact, as we get into the bimodal centrist by nature could be folks that actually believe extremes on both the right and the left of any given issue. So we talk a lot about that. We talked about independent thought. We talked about, how people just come to form their opinions and thoughts. Talk about why disagreements are more common than agreements. And then we really kind of circled around and kind of came full circle and went through it a few times from a few different perspectives. So we did have a bit of an audio issue throughout the recording. It was entirely my fault. It was on Cody's side, but I didn't tell him until it was too late. But I spent a bunch of time editing and trying to smooth out a lot of the scraping sound that you'll still hear some of it, but I think it's manageable, and I think it won't be too distracting. So, but anyway, I enjoyed the conversation. I hope you do as well. And with that, I give you Cody. Well, Cody, I appreciate you coming on, man. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, Vinny.
So, I found, how I found you was, and I don't even know why I guess it's the whole political thing, right? I've always been in this theme of what's the deal with this left versus right, and why does it get so animous, and it kind of drives me nuts. And we've all gotten to those traps of with family and friends and that whole thing. And so I've always been a fan of, I shouldn't say always, as I've matured, I've always been I've always kind of find myself being more in the center. And so I always Google things like I don't even know what the hell I was Googling, but could this country, or could Congress exist if everyone just thought every issue through and
Yeah,
it didn't actually jump to their default side and things
right.
like that. And this, obviously, I don't believe it can happen, but I think our conversation hopefully will kind of reveal some of what's possible there. But so anyway, long story short, I found your article called "The Bimodal Centrist,"
Oh, yeah.
which I thought was really cool. And you touched on a lot. You summarized a lot of things that you'd almost think were common sense till you really dig into your writing, and you just kind of articulated some of it so well. And I just said, I got to talk to this guy. It was really cool. So, I guess before we jump in, you want to tell the listeners like who you are and what you got going on?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, my name is Cody. In the fall, I'll be starting as a PhD student at Oxford in experimental psychology. Before that, I've worked in several different psychology labs, most recently at Harvard. And right now, I'm sort of focusing on my freelance writing in between those gigs. So that's where I'm at.
Hmm, very cool. And now with psychologytoday.com, is that a weekly thing you're doing, or?
Yeah, that's a personal goal that I sort of have imposed there. But as you know, I'm interested in different things and always trying to, uh, you know, do new things. So
Right.
we'll see how that evolves. But it's definitely a great platform to get started on. If I have a random idea, I can put down on paper, send it out there in the world, and
Right.
get a sense of how you'll respond to it.
Very cool. Now,
Yeah.
I mean, not to diverge too much here, but something else that caught my interest on I think I found it on your actual website. And I'll put the link to to your website and a lot of your work in the show notes, so listeners can
Great.
find you. But you also, I don't know if you're still doing it, or you were at least, I think for a couple of years you were managing the computational cognitive neuroscience lab at Harvard.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I mean, I dug into that a little bit. It seems super cool. What goes on there? Like, what's some of the top level goals of that lab?
Right. That lab is run by a professor named Sam Gershman, a younger guy, and the basic premise of the lab is to take models and ideas from artificial intelligence and
Mm,
then use those to predict activation in the brain as well as human behavior. And so, they'll whatever they'll take some algorithm or family of algorithms from whatever's happening in AI and see how well that's able to explain human behavior.
mm.
And so it's both the idea is to sort of further the frontiers on all ends from our understanding of the mind and how humans work, as well as being able to create machines that are better equipped to act like.
That's super interesting. Yeah, AI has been I mean, artificial intelligence and machine learning is for me. It's just so super interesting. I've actually done already 2 podcasts just on that alone.
Totally.
Or even podcasts or episodes that haven't been focused on that tend to, I find a way to pull that in somehow. So
Yeah.
it's just
Cool.
super interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
with the autonomous vehicles coming and just the amount of, I, I'm a software engineer
Yeah.
by trade, and just and I don't know half of what the details of what these AI systems are actually doing, but I know
Well,
enough just
neither
to
do
know
the
that.
AI researchers. So
Well, that's true, right? I mean, it's just, but and a lot of it's really cool when you start to think of in fact, I was listening to a podcast yesterday on this where you forget that some of the back end reasoning we do, that these autonomous vehicles are going to have to do, that doesn't really like, in other words, they were talking about, I think the example was, when you're driving past a cow pasture, a bunch of the folks in this local area, and I forgot the details, but it was just basically like the folks know that if the cows are grazing, for example, that they're probably going to be up ahead of the road, you know, uh, in a certain miles up ahead of the road. So
right.
it's almost like, how do that's something that, how does that, just with basic sensors coming in, that type of reasoning and forethought is something that AI is just not there yet. But um just super interesting, super cool. But again, see how I just almost
Absolutely.
diverged this whole conversation.
Yeah.
Anyway, the bimodal centrist, right? Sounds like
Sure.
can you define that?
Right. So the concept behind that article was that when people usually think of centrism, they, for obvious reasons, think of the center, right? They think
Mm,
of the middle. But if you study, sort of whatever high school statistics or whatever, the first thing you learn is that there are several different kinds of middle, right? There's means, modes, all these different things going on there.
right.
And so you could, in theory, have someone that was in the middle on average, but wasn't unimodally distributed, meaning not everything sort of lined up like right in the center. But if
Right,
you had a
right.
little bit on the left, a little bit on the right, on average, you would be in the middle, but you wouldn't actually have to have any of your beliefs be centered at all. And uh, the basic definition of it. And I am kind of interested in this idea because I think it solves a lot of or it addresses a lot of the issues that we have with, highly partisan identity politics
Hmm.
and that sort of stuff, right? So yeah, that was the basis for the article.
Right, right, right. Very cool. Yeah, and I think you had said at one point, I have it right here. You pretty much said, at its core, bimodal centrism is just an acknowledgement that the world's complicated.
Right.
I'm like, I mean, that's a perfect way to sum it up. But,
Yeah.
you know, from that, I kind of take, well, if the world is complicated, and we know it is, then no one thinker really could have all their views 100% consistent to any one side. So
Right.
it just doesn't make any sense. So,
Yeah.
and I tend to think, well, what, and we'll jump in a little bit. You kind of talk about, um, I think how the bimodal centrist addresses 3 key problems, that you think hinders productive political engagement. So we'll jump into that in a second. But um, I just tend to think, if someone, if you're on the right or on the left, and you always are, if you, I think just politicians by nature have to be in a state of hypocrisy, right? You can't always believe what this whole party believes. You have to acknowledge that you're shutting a part of your brain off, or or just going along with it for some percentage of the issue, right? I think that's the only
Right.
logical way that the whole thing makes sense. So, I do you think? I mean, again, and this is going to touch on politics because of the nature of the discussion. But I mean, do you think in
Totally.
general, our two-party system could actually function if it was made up of almost all bimodal centrists? I don't see how that would work.
Well, I think so. There's a number of things going on here. It'll be difficult to touch on all the relevant ones, but I think one thing that's worth talking about is that there are different amounts of effort that it takes
Mm,
to um, so coming up with your own, basically doing all the diligence, forming your own opinion, going to all of the original sources, combating with your
right,
friends and colleagues and family, that sort of stuff. All of that takes a lot of
right,
effort, right? And um, uh, there is just going to be varying degrees in terms of how much effort people are willing to go against the grain, so to speak, of the people they care about and who are in their lives.
hmm,
And any sort of process by which you say, okay, well, what's the sort of current of the group versus, oh, what do I really feel about that? The group is always going to be a much easier thing to go with in terms of trying to figure out what your own perspective is on
right,
it. So I think that's one thing. Another thing would be that there's a sort of similar issue here is that um, uh, it has to do with the people that we're close with, right? It has to do with how we view ourselves as a part of, their social group. And so political ideologies aren't just a function of what you believe in terms of, I think these are the policies we should enact, or this is how I think society ought to work, but they're a function of the social uh, structure that you're involved with,
right,
right?
right,
So people don't necessarily just believe conservative or liberal ideas because those are they've done all the research and those are the ones that concluded with. It's much more complicated and it has a lot to do more to do with social reasons necessarily than intellectual ones.
hmm,
And so that's
exactly,
something that's super unsatisfying about centrism, right? Is that there's a lot of uh, identity built up around the political left and the political right, but there's not that same, uh, and partially it's because it is less extreme. There's not that same middle ground where you can uh, be a part of this sort of like larger group. At least not in the way we have now.
right, right. Yeah. No. So that, I mean, that was a good summary. I think that's you kind of really you nailed it there. I mean, and I always kind of ask what I'm kind of. I think folks ask, if they ask me, "Hey, are you Republican or Democrat?" Now I have certain leanings in certain ways, but I almost want to. My new kind of, I guess, 2019 way of approaching things is, well, I don't know what issue you're talking about. Like,
Sure.
I'm not in politics. I don't have to join a side. In fact.
Or you can deny that political binaries exist, right? That's the other 2019 move. Is you're like, oh, it's a spectrum. It's not a binary.
Well, isn't that a good thing? Well, I guess that's well, yeah, that whole non-binary thing is just I feel like touching on a lot of different domains, but I kind of like that idea, right? Shouldn't everything be? I mean, there's like binary doesn't really work, doesn't exist in nature. Everything's analog, everything's continuous, right? Everything's a certain degree of something.
Yeah.
So I just like that approach of, well, what topic are you asking me about, this or that? I'll tell you how I feel. It
Right.
may confuse the hell out of you because on one argument, one issue I'm all the way this way, the other issue I'm all the way this way. So, but isn't that okay? We're not in politics. We don't need this giant machine behind us to, so isn't that okay? Um,
Totally.
but I don't think a lot of folks feel that way. I think they want to be part of the tribe as well, even folks that aren't in politics, right? I just think they just want to, but I just think it's such a dumbing down of your own independent thought. If you got these two columns and on every issue, you just have to check one and you have to check everything in this column or that column. I think that's a dumbing down of our own ability. I think we need
So
to.
why do you think people choose that instead of whether it's specifically bimodal centrism or whatever? Why is it dumbed down instead of thinking through
I think,
each issue?
well, I think you really touched on it earlier. I think it's easier, right? I think it's so relieving to. I mean, I think we're all tribal, right? I think we
Yeah.
we 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 want to be social and part of a family, whether that's lowercase f or capital F family. And I think
Yeah.
politics, like you said earlier, it's politics aren't just something over on Capitol Hill, in this weird place called Washington D.C. and might be right in your backyard if you're here where I live, or if you're across the country, it's further away. But I think it's more. Obviously it comes inside your home, right? When you start talking about some of the issues, you're talking about, does God exist, abortion, who to accept, who not to accept, in society, what type of tax breaks go to what people based on their who they want to love or marry. It's a lot of stuff
Yeah.
that touches your heart, right? So it's I think if you generally have a theme, if you generally have I would say if you're 60-70% one way just based on your overall leanings, that
Yeah.
that effort to think through the other 30% and maybe perhaps jump on the other side, I think is a lot of work for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
So I think it's a matter of effort, and I think but then what happens is, I think over the years, and if I think if I did this study, I think the data would show that, especially as you get older, the older relatives, older friends, older folks that I've spoken to, they got their heels dug in. They're not about to
Right.
change, you know, something they've believed in for, or they, the the grinding of the sharpening of whatever their sword over the however many years has been tuned to some direction. They're not about to start undoing that
Yeah.
in their later years, I think. I mean, so I don't know, it's complicated, but I do think, in short, I think it comes down to effort. I think, you and I having this conversation, you
Right.
write the article, me to prep for this, you and I had these conversations. That's not as easy as just saying, no, Republicans are terrible, or liberals are wimps, or whatever the hell the angle you want to take. That's
Yeah.
just
Sure.
easier, and and then you start to make friends and build relationships and social engagements around that. You
Yeah.
know, I think it's just harder, frankly.
One thing I also have noticed is that I feel like people who try to be independently minded, it can be lonely, right?
Mm,
Because if basically, so one of the ways I think about it is, if you have a conversation between two people,
yep.
you have to have a conversation about something that the two people have in common, right?
Right. Right.
So there's sort of this lowest common denominator sort of uh, top conversation topic that's happening, and between two people, like, if you delve in, there's probably a good amount of stuff in that.
Right.
But then if you added a third person to that conversation, then the number of things that that you really care about or know about or have something to say about that's common between all three of you drops dramatically,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
So the more people you have, the more whatever's on the table conversationally has to be something either in your immediate environment, which is what you all share,
Right.
or something pretty general, without requiring a ton of your personal background
Right.
information.
Yeah. Yeah.
So uh, to me, like, part of the other thing here is that if you want to really get into the nuances of ideas, it's really hard to do that with um, more than one other person. So in anything other than a conversation, otherwise you really just have to speak in too big of generalities. And most of the time, when you're trying to develop your own perspectives on something, you have to do it alone, right? You have to do a lot of reading, which is a solitary activity,
Yep.
and sitting there and think, well, okay, well, what I just read this. Well, what do I think about this, right? And you can work through it with other people, but I think uh, figuring out what you think about something in a nuanced way is really a lonely process, in addition to being effortful.
Right. Yeah. 100% agree there. I mean, so it's funny you say that, because one of the genesis, one of the reasons for me to start this podcast was, you basically just kind of explained it. And that is, I enjoy having these conversations that you and I are having right now. I
Yeah.
truly enjoy that. Like my goal going into a topic is really to explore what I think about it, what other people think about it, if I could learn something from them. I'm far from perfect. Sometimes I've had plenty of heated discussions, right? But I'm trying to have less of those and more
Sure.
like, let's actually have a discussion. And I'm not trying to win anything. You shouldn't be trying to win anything. But that approach, to your point earlier of having three or more, you're right. It degrades quickly when you have 3, 4, 5 folks, especially in a gathering where people don't really want to have that conversation. They're just looking to have I feel like most people anyway. I mean, I'm tending to gravitate towards friends that enjoy this type of conversations, more and more. But in
Yeah.
general, I think people in general, social gatherings and whatnot aren't really looking to have this conversation. Like first of all, it's much more time consuming. You need the long form, uninterrupted, um, you know, I'd say platform type of thing where you're not, people aren't running in and kids are jumping around you and the music's loud and someone needs a new burger and someone needs a new beer. Like you can't like actually get through,
Yeah.
in a social, get through the conversation in the social environment. And people just want to just, yeah, those freaking liberals, that's freaking, that's much easier and it's much more accepted and everyone kind of nods and, people stick to their clicks. But you're right. It doesn't really, I just think it comes down to effort. And if you, and generally it only would work if folks, like I said, going into the discussion with the just intellectual curiosity as their ultimate, driving force, not really like, I
Yeah.
can't wait to push this guy over to this side, or this gal to push her over to this other side. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think another thing that makes those sort of conversations difficult is they're very emotional, right?
Mhm.
And so I think there's this weird pretense that we assume that those conversations and those problems are intellectual problems, right? Well, that if I can present my argument and my interlocutor hears it and they
Right.
disagree, but then like I give them this devastating argument, and then they're like, oh well, shit, everything
Yeah,
that I
exactly.
thought is right. And it's not, that's not how that's kind of, I think, our model for we imagine for how these things work, but in reality, I mean, that's not how things work, and it is all entangled in this highly emotional, highly identity, who we are and how we relate to the world type stuff.
Absolutely. No, that's very true.
Yeah.
You're right. I would say as I've matured over the years, I've learned that. But that's the one thing I've looking back like 10 years. I'm a big fan of when I'm 30, I'm looking back when I was a 20, I was like, what an idiot I was. And I'm 40, I'm looking back when I was a 30, what an idiot. So I'm trying to get ahead of that and realize I'm an idiot. I'm always going to be an idiot. So just be humble and try to learn instead of just thinking, right? So I think
Oh
that's the
man,
better
yeah.
approach, I think, in life. So
Oh
I'll look
yeah.
back and say I was less of an idiot because I assumed I was an idiot and just, but I would say looking back, I very much fell into that trap quite often where I'm going to just come to the table with, and this is not, and I'm not talking about like formal debate club type stuff. I'm just talking about in life where you have a disagreement with
Right.
somebody.
Like cocktail
Exactly.
party, or like like your lunch with
Yep.
whatever.
And it just went, it's, if I just have this rock star logical breakdown and I open it up, I deliver it, and then I close it out, they just, there goes a stand up, say, wow, you could, that's, I'm on your, I'm on your page now. And you're right, it's not the case at all, right? It's usually, even when
Yeah.
other folks would almost sort of you can feel them almost agreeing with you logically, their emotions
Yeah.
just aren't around it, and it's much more emotional than you realize, and logic alone is not going to do it. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Absolutely.
that's interesting.
Well, so I've actually been starting this newsletter recently where I review s- basically like my favorite papers from psychology and say like, okay, here's the paper and here's the main idea and here's the
Hmm.
takeaways from it. And, pick something in the theme. One of the ones I did recently was um, basically my favorite psychology papers on how people form and change their
Mm,
beliefs, which is pretty much exactly what we're
right,
talking
right.
about right now. And to give just a couple highlights from that. So one is there's a great social psychologist named Jonathan Haidt who's doing really well right now with his book Coddling of the American Mind. Terrible title,
Hmm.
great book.
How do you spell his last name? I
He's
know, I definitely know the name.
Haidt,
Okay.
and he's a wonderful, centrist esque thinker. But anyway, his famous paper, one of his famous papers as a psychologist, is called um, "The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail: A Social Intuitionist Model for Human Moral Judgments," or something like that. And the idea is that what drives our thoughts and positions about the things you were mentioning earlier, like
Hmm.
abortion, political identity, this that all those things that get really heated are we have an emotional reaction to them first, which is, this social and cultural sort of phenomenon. We learn it from the people around us. And then, because humans are so clever, we come up with reasons afterwards, like, okay, well, this is why this is a reasonable position, in addition to just being the ultimately correct one. And so if you go back and look at that, if you take Haidt's word on that and be like, okay, well, that's how it's working, then that makes sense of why the intellectual argument doesn't break down some of those barriers. It's because the core of where these ideas or positions are coming from is from a fundamentally emotional response, something much more visceral, something that comes out of you and you can't quell the sort of fast heartbeat and tenseness that comes with discussing someone who feels the opposite of you on that. Those sort of things, rather than having put together some Aristotelian logic of here's the premises and here's the conclusion.
Right. Yeah. So now you touch on again, getting back to I think what we alluded to earlier. Highlight, I guess, talk us through what you think. You bring up three main problems that that's, and we say hindering political engagement, but I think this would apply to any engagement with any two human beings, or that having to be on either side of anything. You say the bimodal centrist addresses three key problems hindering engagement, right? Apathy, extremism, and warring tribes. Can you kind of summarize what that's all about?
Absolutely. So apathy, I think one reason centrists get a bad rap is that sort of taking on this label of centrist, it kind of implies that you don't care, right? That you're too apathetic to take a stand one way or the other, which is why you end up just sort of middling through the whole thing. And I think the idea of the sort of traditional idea of centrism is that when you look at the issues and then you see it's complicated, you're like, okay, well, that's sort of the end of the line. That's as far as I'm willing to go.
Right, you're afraid to make a bad move or the wrong decision, or like starting is hard because it's so complicated. It's probably there's a fear if I start moving, I'm going to be moving in the wrong direction. So why start at all? That's kind of the way I read, some of your write-ups.
And it's also, I think, a sensitivity to, it also comes from a certain sensitivity to complication, right? It's that they can see that, okay, well, there's an argument on both sides, and maybe they're not sure which way to go with it. So I do think it also comes from still a sensitivity to that. But at the end of the day, I think what this notion of bimodal centrism allows one to do is say, okay, well, it's complicated, but here's what we should do. Right, here's I'm going to cut through the complication and say, well, we have to do something here, and we're not just going to let everyone else figure it out. And here's where I come out on it. Maybe, and it's not guaranteed which side it's going to be, and maybe there'll be some caveats on whatever the position is, but it allows you to sort of overcome that. I think not incorrect characterization of centrism that a lot of people end up there because it's I'm not sure what's going to happen either way. It's complicated, and either way it's not going to affect you that much. So I think it overcomes that problem. So that's one thing. Another thing is extremism, right? And one thing that I noted on the article is this idea of an echo chamber, right, which is this metaphor that people use. But it's actually kind of, I think the metaphor is slightly wrong, because an echo chamber would be something where you say something and then it comes back to you, like there's high level reverberation, and then it echoes back to you a few times, then it sort of dwindles away. What's happening, and what we talk about as echo chambers, is that you say something and then it gets magnified, it echoes back to you, and every time you hear it, it gets much louder and louder and louder and louder, right? And one way to so the effect of that being that you're more and more certain about
Right,
what
and you call that the reverse
uh,
echo chamber. I've heard that before. I'm not sure if you coined it. I don't think you coined the term, but
I'm
it's
sure I didn't
100%
coin it.
accurate, right? And it really does depict, that those sound waves aren't diminishing like a normal echo,
Yeah,
right? They're actually amplifying. Exactly.
yeah. So yeah, I think one good general, this was, I'm pretty sure I didn't mention it in the article, but I'm pretty sure one thing that started my thinking on this, sort of general interest in bimodal distributions, that concept is from uh, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, author of The Black
Hmm.
Swan and some other books. Crazy guy, very smart. Um, and he one of the general themes of his books is one way to deal with the unpredictability and the lopsided gains and losses of the world is to invest in things bimodally, right? And so I can't remember the exact you know example he uses, but his background is as a Wall Street trader. So there's like, okay, well, if you have a small bit in a high risk investment and then a large stake in a low risk investment or something like that, you have the payoffs of the high risk investment, but you won't have as big a downside because you have the so there's stuff like
Right, right.
that. There's he also talks about it in terms of he has all his crackpot theories, which are amazing for health and nutrition and that sort of stuff. That for his theory of like working out is that you should either be lifting the maximum amount that your body can do, which is one end of the
Hmm.
distribution, or you should be just basically like ambling and walking around and exerting your body in the sense that it's doing some physical activity, but not doing it. And he says you should just cut out the jogging, right? So this is example
Hmm.
of a bimodal.
Right,
So
right,
he has all these sort of things, and I think it's a good way to mitigate extremism in political
right,
ideology.
right. Now with extremism, and I've said this before, but uh, with this whole reverse echo chamber concept, and I really do think that phrase is perfect for this whole thing, right? If you're surrounding yourselves with exactly the same belief systems and folks that believe exactly what you believe, you're just not going to grow. You're going, like you said, you're going to hear exactly what you're saying coming back at you. And
Yeah,
that's kind of a problem with the small town mentality, right? I'm from a small town. There's a lot of good that comes from being in a small town. There's a real good
absolutely.
community. It's I mean, I can go on and on with in my opinion, the benefits of a small community. However, the negative is truly that you really all believe the same thing. And there's probably
Yeah,
exceptions, but in at least in my experience, you go to the same churches, you watch the same news channels, you tend to, people don't really travel much. They don't really know what the world is all about. They know whatever channel they're watching or whatever Facebook feeds they follow are telling them,
right.
and their close friends and family are saying the same thing. So it's you know, I think hopefully, I'm thinking, long term as travel gets easier and cheaper and faster, then maybe we can all, even the folks that don't traditionally travel and leave their hometown, right? Where I'm from, a lot of folks
Yeah,
don't leave home. It's crazy that I left my hometown from a small town in New England, but I
sure.
think that would be at least a step towards an antidote to that type of extremism issue. Well, we'll
Yeah.
see, but um,
I think the small town, the point you're making about small towns, a lot of the good things about it goes back to what we were saying earlier about conversations, right? Where you have a handful of people are gathered. What they talk about is in large part determined by what they have in common,
right.
right? And so if you are, uh, in a small community and you go to the same church, you go to the same football games, et cetera, that gives you actually quite a lot to talk
Mhm.
about, right? Or whatever, something more important than just talking about it or whatever. But it gives you this common basis of
Right.
knowledge, right?
Yep.
And so uh,
And of interest, right?
that,
General interest. You're actually
right,
generally
yeah.
interested in the stuff that you're seeing every day and your kids are
And
seeing
that's a
every day.
great
Right.
thing,
Exactly.
right? you're close to those people in an extremely meaningful way, in a way that's really difficult to do as a professional in a
Right.
big city,
Hmm.
right? It's super difficult to forge those same kinds of connections or to suss out those
Yep.
commonalities,
Mhm.
right? But at the same time, by virtue of getting a lot of people who have that same thing in common, it makes it sort of insular, right? So there's a little bit of a paradox here, which is that if you want the good things of being in a community, a lot of it comes at the cost of excluding people outside of that
Right.
community.
For sure.
Not necessarily in a
Hmm.
malicious way or even an explicit way, but it's just by virtue of like having this group of people who have a lot in common and don't all go out and do different things and have one person go to Ireland and one person go to
Right.
Algeria,
Exactly.
right?
Right.
They all go to Foxborough
Right.
for the Patriots game or whatever.
That's right. Forgot you're from Boston. Yeah. Nice reference. That's in my heart still there. So that's awesome. Red Sox
Yeah.
bats. Yep. Um, yeah, no, it's true. It's a good point, and but I think ultimately, I think we all right now we inhabit one big sphere. It's called, and sorry, flat earthers, but it is a sphere. Um, but we occupy this giant thing. I think we as humans need to do our best to see the whole globe. I just think because that's our expand as far as our knowledge goes, that's where human beings have expanded to this one globe. I think I just think there's a lot of good in travel and just seeing the world. And that's not easy for me either. My wife will tell you that I'm a I like to stay home and work on things and do things. So,
Right.
but for me to move from New England to Washington D.C. was like, what the hell are you doing? Like I got a lot of those
Right.
like, why everything's here, your family, everyone loves you here. What are you doing? Um,
So this is something that I'm also really interested in is that how is people being able to go and see new places going to change their thinking about people who would otherwise be sort of abstract entities on the other side of the globe, right? And one thing that's interesting from psychology and sociology, in as much as I look into it, is that I haven't found people who are giving us good research-based answers for how traveling somewhere in a relatively casual manner changes the way we think about those people and essentially humanizing those
right.
people, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
But I agree with you from what it sounds like you're saying that I think that like, okay, wow, there's actually this, when you have a connection with a people in a place that are, on the other side of the globe, that's something special, right? That sticks with you and it gives you, a this deep connection. I think it's
Oh,
important.
for sure. I mean, if you, I overthink everything, and I've seen, the United States is, you don't get into this, but we've obviously been through several wars. Some would say we're always at war,
Yeah.
right? And I have had discussions with folks that have been, you know, heavy travelers and have spent they just pride themselves and I shouldn't say pride themselves. They have a passion for traveling abroad into the third world countries and sitting with tribes and really going off the grid and they don't just do the whole, hey, I want to go to Africa and do the touristy thing through Tanzania and spend 20 grand and be pampered, right? They want to go and actually
Sure.
experiment, experience the continent, the people, the reality, right? So
Right.
and I have a few friends like that. And when I, when the United States is engaged in some conflict, it's Afghanistan or wherever it is, right? In Iran, wherever it may be, when I interface with many people that have maybe never left their hometown, they have a very specific feeling, and it's usually, hey, screw them, we're right. And taking patriotism out of it for a second, but and then I speak to you kind of interact with the other folks that maybe they live with a family for 3 months because when they went abroad, that maybe is in this
Yeah.
country that we're currently engaged in conflict with. It's a whole different feeling. They may very
Right.
well feel, hey, the United States, we're still the greatest country, we got to do what we got to do, but they have a whole nother level of just compassion towards what that foreign country is going through with us. And so it's you definitely because they
Right.
because you said it earlier, there's a level of, you see them more at, you see them at a human level. You don't just see them as the other, right? I think
Right.
we easily can look at a group of folks that don't look like us, don't talk like us, aren't near here. That's the other. Go get them. Whereas, sorry, but they're probably not much more different than us. They have children that they love. When their children are laughing and happy, they're happy. When they're
Yeah.
it's all there's definitely a least common denominator that binds all of us humans. And I think folks that interact with the more humans we interact with from different walks, just the more we kind of see that. I think it's so easy to be blind to that whole thing. So yeah, I've definitely observed the difference in perspectives from folks that might be more the hometowners versus the more folks that are just more liberal in their travel and their so
Absolutely. Yeah.
um,
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interconnected stuff here, right? So one thing that I think is really interesting is that so in these constellations of beliefs that are relatively generally conservative versus
mhm,
generally liberal, one thing that accompanies or one thing that separates them is how threatening you view the world to be, right? So um, conservatism, being conservative, is a rational response to a world that is dangerous and out to get to you, right?
mhm,
So if the world is um, uh, it like basically to the extent to which the world is a scary place where bad people want to do harm to you, then it actually for a whole host of reasons, conservatism is the
right,
rational
yeah,
response
yeah,
to that. And so to me, at the core, one of the big cores of liberal versus conservative thought is that liberals, and in the travel example, people who go out there, hold generally liberal opinions, tend to think of humanity as one collective, group in the same boat, tend to view the world as a place where yes, bad things happen, but at the end of the day, we all want the same things, which is to see our children
right,
laugh, to not die in a war, etc. Where more generally conservative views that we, should take care of number one
yep,
first, should have an allegiance to people in our hometown, these sort of things. They're consistent with a worldview that views, um, you know, the other people out there as people who are, you know, the world is a fundamentally uh,
right,
antagonistic place, and I think there's definitely good reasons to be in both those camps. So I
exactly,
also agree with you in principle, with yes, let's all be part of the collective, and that's definitely how my life personally has played out. It's been much more this, let's go out there and see what other people are doing rather than invest in my community back home. But I can see myself paying a huge price for having that mindset versus all of the people who sort of did the other thing,
yeah,
which was stay back there and everything that goes along with that, which I bet mirrors your
yeah,
experience quite a
100%, 100%. Yeah, like I was saying, uh, there's definitely a level of comfort, that comes into that just if that I remember driving down to DC when I left for the first time. It was 2005, and that was not a comforting feeling. I mean, I was like, I didn't know
bit.
really what I was doing. I just knew I wanted to experience it. That was pretty obvious.
Yeah, right,
It's kind of one of those things I say, do it scared. Anytime you're trying to do something new, just do it scared. Just go.
right. Yeah, I
Yeah, I
like
love
that,
it
dude.
too.
It's
I think,
good.
in fact, my wife
That's
just made
funny.
that comment a while ago about something I was doing. Just I was like, hesitating on. It always stuck with me. There was, excellent words. You just think about it. So I felt that way, headed to DC. But so yeah,
It goes back to what we were talking about earlier with this sort of
hmm
loneliness in a sense, right? That there's not that that's exactly the right word to describe it,
it's pretty damn
but there
close.
is
It is. Yeah.
it's yeah, there's definitely a huge part of it where you're going out there, you don't know the people, you're starting something new, you're
Yep.
vulnerable, and a lot of those initial problems you're gonna have to overcome, by yourself or with your, in your case
Yep.
with your
Yep.
core family and that sort of stuff. But not without you don't have the support of the whole
Right.
community behind you. So I think saying it is comfort That's definitely part of it, but I think it's also more robust than that, right? It's not just a drive to like, it's not just about comfort, but I think it's, there's an argument to be made that it's also staying within that the hometown essentially. There's something very meaningful, very rooted about that.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, the whole sense of community, I
and
think,
I
I mean, community is super powerful. I think we're social creatures, right? I think
Yeah,
it's a good thing. It certainly is. But you're right. It's a double edged sword, right? There's pros and cons there, like everything else, right?
totally.
Exactly.
Like everything else, which is why you got to be
Exactly, right.
environmental centrist. But
Pulling it back to that. Yep.
but one of my favorite authors, his name is Wendell Berry, and his general story is that he grew up in Kentucky. His family were tobacco farmers, and then he went off to college, ended up, doing pretty well for himself as a writer in New York City, Stanford, I think, whatever. He had these fellowships, and he was making it out there. And then he went back to he decided to like let all that go and go back to Kentucky. Um, and really explore what his connection to the land. The land is a sort of
Hmm.
larger metaphor for the
Yeah, yeah.
people in the community, all that sort of the history
Not
and
just
all
the
this sort
dirt.
of
Got
stuff.
it. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah,
also the dirt.
yeah.
But don't discount the dirt. It actually has a lot to do with the dirt. But there's all of these things that by going back and looking at history and connectedness and literal dirt and literal
Mhm.
hills and oh, my grandfather did such and such over here and exploring all that sort of stuff. That's stuff that you lose out by up and moving to
Yeah.
DC or Boston or
Yep.
or that sort of
Yep.
stuff. So there's something big to
Yeah,
be
for
released there.
sure. Now, just pulling it back to to your blog. So yeah, so we talked
Yeah,
about apathy, the three key problems, right? So we talked about apathy, extremism, and then warring
right.
tribes. That one for me was it really hit home. Now explain what that one is.
Mhm. Right. So I think the idea of tribes kind of gets a bad rap nowadays, but tribes are not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because it's totally okay to have a special fondness for your family and
Hmm.
friends, right? The problem is when tribes decide, to go to
Right.
war, right? When they decide that their um, goals are best advanced by antagonizing other people, going out there and figuring out how they can screw with the other side today.
Right.
And I think that you know that's definitely a tough part of you know today's polarization is that what comes with it is a lot of okay, well, here's 50% of the people and they're
Right.
the bad people, and that's a really tough problem to have, I think.
Yeah, the one thing, and I'm just going to read it verbatim because I think it's pretty brilliant. Like it just sums it up, and I never really thought of it this way, but um, the problem is not that some have liberal views and others have conservative views. It's when, for example, and I think you give this example, the liberal side believes the conservatives reach their point of view through an irredeemable disposition of ignorance and malice, right? So I like
Right.
that because it got me thinking where, if you start, if you tend to, if you understand more how someone arrived, the mental gymnastics they went through to arrive at their decision, um, you would
Yeah.
start to realize it's not they didn't come to that conclusion just because they wanted to screw the other side. So if you're,
Right.
and I'll give a little personal example. I'm traditionally a more pro-life thinker, and I've had a conversation with folks, and I just remember one person just kind of really, it was a heartfelt discussion, and they were really,
Right.
and they laid their heart on the table and said, well, you just got the main theme was, I see all these children that are not wanted, that are rejected, that are going through hell because their mom or dad wasn't ready to have them, and and we started talking through that dialogue, and it wasn't
Right.
groundbreaking, um, in a sense, with that because that's been an argument for folks, in the pro-choice arena for a while. But just hearing them say it in the heartfelt and realize what a hard decision it was for them to come through this decision and to land on the pro-choice side, for me, it was eye opening. It's like, and I think it hit home when I
Yeah.
read, your piece is really when you really truly understand the thought process one used to get to their final position. I do think you tend to be less extreme in your views because you realize, wow, that they're just not doing this out of pure malice or screw the other side. They actually put a lot of thought into this, and they acknowledge internally it's complicated, but they just so happen to land on this side because they kind of weighed, they put weights to their opinions of all these different categories, and they were, kind of settled on one side. So that really hit home when I read that piece on that you had written. So very cool. Yeah,
Well, thank you very much. It's very kind of you to say. So I
sure.
do appreciate that. And yeah, and I think that it is. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, there there needs to be a little bit more generosity of spirit, right? I think our initial inclination when we're faced with someone who holds a different opinion than ourselves is to have like a negative reaction to it, right? I think that's fine because I think that's just naturally the way it's going to happen, to assume that okay, well they probably, don't understand this. They're probably, angry. They're probably, to attribute something
Right.
quote negative to them. But I think the thing that is missing is going back a little bit later once the emotions have subsided, right? Because I think that's a really good life decision making process. Let the emotions happen. Don't make the decision then. Once the emotions are gone, then figure out what's actually
Right.
happening. Make the right decisions, right? And so when you're trying to think through, someone you disagree with, in the moment you'll feel the negative reaction to them, but then it's important to go back later and think like, oh, well, actually, they said something that, and if you think about it like this, then well, it does, like that is how they got there, and I could see why that would make sense to someone who's been in their position and had their experiences, and maybe grew up where they did or had something happen to them, whatever it is, right? And being willing to have
Hmm.
that later benefit of the doubt to try and go down the rabbit hole and figure out, well, okay, let's assume that they weren't just acting out of malice, or they're not just
Right.
completely ignorant. How would it make sense to get from where they've been to like
Hmm.
where they are now? So, and there's also this quote that I love from Bertrand Russell. Uh, it basically to the effect that it's important not to be angry with opinions different from your own, but he says to set to work understanding how they come
Right.
about. If after you understand them they still seem false, you can combat them much more effectually than if you continue to be
Yes.
merely
Yep.
horrified.
Brilliant.
And
Yeah.
that to me is the core of the issue. Um, is don't respond with anger. Try and figure out what's happening. You might learn
Right.
something.
Right. Right.
God
Right.
forbid. And if you don't, then you'll be in a better position to, make your point with them, right? And that to me, kind of
I would
describes the
almost argue, you just
process.
touched on something else. You might learn something. I think, and this is kind of a bold statement. I feel like if you don't learn something from every conversation, and I'm not saying like you go and get a coffee in the morning, say good morning, how you doing, and you leave. But any conversation of any type, of any depth at all, 5 minutes and above, let's say, just for some arbitrary threshold. If you don't walk away
Yeah.
learning something, I just don't think you're not listening, right? I mean, whether you're talking to the lowest, maybe the youngest and the least experienced human being alive, all the way to the wisest elderly person, I feel like you could almost learn something from every interaction. But again, going back to our original point, it's hard and it takes,
Right.
I consider myself weird as hell. You're probably just like me. I overthink everything. I think things through all day long. I'm having a blast having this conversation with you at a podcast on a Saturday afternoon. Like that's not normal, I don't think, for most human beings, right? So it's much easier to be like,
Probably
hey,
not.
you're pro-choice, then that means you kill babies, and I'm out, and I hate you. That's just
Right.
so to walk through that, those mental minefields, landmine. It's just, I think it's hard. I think it's just a lot of effort, and I don't think it's a lot of folks are willing to do that.
We'll see. For me, it goes to what we were saying about the the thinking is something that occurs when you're
Mm,
on your own, right? So it's not necessarily in the moment that you learn the most from those conversations. I mean, if someone tells you a new fact that you didn't know, and that fact is useful or interesting or changes the way you think about something,
right,
that's one thing. But for me, what I often find is that they said something that, like, well, that I don't think that works like that, or well, that's not how I assume things are
right.
going on. Right? Like, what? Well, but what
Hmm.
did they mean
Hmm.
by that, right? And then so it's that. to me, there's something that like rubs in the moment where it's like, okay, there's something that I wasn't expecting here. And then it might be like, as you're
The
walking
post-production
back home
churn, right?
after that
Yeah,
chat,
yeah, yeah.
or, a week later it
Right.
pops into your mind. But that process, you have to like not be thinking about something else, which means you can't be like plugged into like listening to like music or even
Mhm.
like an audiobook or whatever. You have to not go straight into another conversation. You have to not be like
Right.
busy with work and email, right? There's just it's like there's everything is conspiring to distract you to not go back and mull over whatever it was they were thinking about, which is what you have to do to really, in my opinion, learn like get something deep out of whatever they believe that you don't, and why that
Well, I'll tell you,
whatever
you're
occurred in the
right. You're 100%
conversation.
right. In fact, like I'm the type of person. I think it may be more. I definitely got traces of introversion. I like being alone. I like thinking. Some of my most. I recharge in the morning, 4 or 5 in the morning before people get up, and I just think about stuff and take notes about stuff. And hey, what am I
Mm,
going to do in the next podcast? Like that. For me, that's recharging. But I'll have a conversation with somebody at a party. They'll say something. I'll say something and walk away. And then I will start. I'll replay that in my head and following each permutation of where it could have went and wondering why it didn't go one way. I'm like, oh man, I think this person meant that and I didn't mean that. I hope they didn't get offended. That's not what I meant, but I didn't see it at the time. And
yeah.
then I kind of I can't tell you how many times I've done that, right? But those mental gymnastics,
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's mentally and physically exhausting. I mean, it's completely exhausting. But
Yeah.
I think the output of it, the end result is that I tend to be much more cognizant of what everyone's thinking and what everyone's feeling, and hypersensitive to that. Sometimes to a fault, to be honest. But I don't think that's a
Right.
general. I think that's a healthy way for human beings to really interact. I mean, I think it's kind of crazy, to be honest, at times. But yeah,
It
it
can
does,
weigh
and
on
it's
you for
exhausting
sure. If you're being really sensitive to that, there's a lot that
for
can
sure.
really get to you.
For sure. Now, I guess the question that just popped in my head when you were talking, you said that disagreement is kind of I think you said in your article here, disagreement is the default. And now, is that
Right.
is that is there an evolutionary adaptation for that? Why do we do that as humans? Right? Because I think that is the default.
So there was this other little piece that I wrote that you mentioned that sort of makes this claim that disagreement is more common
Mm,
than agreement, right? And it comes back to one of the things that we started the conversation with, is that the world is a complicated place, and one of the um, you know outcomes of trying to deal with that complication is that uh, there's a lot more different opinions than there are common opinions, right? So if you pick anything, right? What's your favorite classical composer? What's your favorite uh, you know
right.
nonfiction author? I don't know. Whatever you're interested in, right? Think about all the different possibilities you could answer that with. And there are all those possibilities because there's just a
Hmm.
lot of stuff out there in the world. And a natural consequence of that is that people are going to uh, gravitate toward different areas in that large landscape, right? That big
Right.
piece of real estate. And so when we look at a complicated problem from a statistical point of view, it's always going to be the case that there are way more things, way more ways to disagree than ways to agree,
Yep. That's just
right?
statistics. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so to me, when you acknowledge that fact, and I think it, just kind of, like it's a little bit intuitive, like once you start to think about it. And once we acknowledge that fact, then I think there's this big insight, which is that when people disagree with you, it's not necessarily because they're against you, right? In fact, it probably has nothing to do with that per se, right? It's just a consequence of them living out their own experience in the world, and
Right.
you living out your experience in the world. And just because the world's a big place, you guys
Right.
landed on different spots. Um, and so I think right now, especially, but humans, I think, have always been this way, but right now, especially, we tend to view disagreement as this really negative thing that's almost just, you know, insurmountable, uh, you know, mountain between people, this,
Hmm.
divide that you pass. And I think we should think about disagreement in a different way, right? Noting a disagreement is the default. We should then say, like, okay, well, um, if someone disagrees with me, it's not because they're against me, just the way things are. And we're going to have to work a little bit harder to find the common ground and areas of agreement and work from there.
Right. And
So
to your point
that's the
that
basic
it's
idea.
and I agree, it's statistically more accurate. I mean, it's just yeah, statistically accurate that it's a higher probability that someone's going to disagree with you than agree with you, right? If you can accept that, which I think the evidence is pretty clear there, but then you'd almost can approach every discussion or with going in knowing, well, the odds of them agreeing with me are pretty low. So when I get a disagreement, that's par for the course. That's exactly what I'm expecting. So expecting that, I feel like, is almost, you're not hit with like, what do you mean you don't think this about whatever? You just kind of, yeah, you assume it. It's almost like you're going in planning that. I think that I use the example of traffic, right? If you're headed to work or headed home from work, more accurately, and you just get crushed with traffic and it takes you an extra hour to get home. If you had looked at the traffic ahead of time and had your audiobook primed up or your podcast you want to listen to, and when you saw those brake lights, you were just expecting it, the response is much less visceral. It's relaxed. It's like, hey, I knew this was coming. So
Right.
I mean, it's just kind of going setting expectations. It's more of a general term, right? But setting expectations seems to help in almost any case. But yeah,
Absolutely. So this is something that I've been sort of on my mind a lot is just how big a role expectations play in
oh, for
our
sure.
uh,
Mm,
emotional satisfaction and emotional reactions and relationships and just all these hugely important things, right? Um, and I think that yeah, coming into an interaction with someone with the right expectations about what that's going to be like is a huge, huge part of the battle right there. And at the end of the day, I just don't think disagreement should be a barrier, right? It shouldn't be something that we have to necessarily overcome, as in that it's this huge negative thing. I think, like you're saying, it's just
right.
par for the course. And once we understand that that's, uh, you know, what par is, then well, okay, well we can figure out how to get under that. So
Yeah, excellent. Well, Cody, I mean, we've gone about an hour here. Was there, I pretty much, I think we kind of, we touched on the general theme of the points that I was looking to touch on. Is there anything else that we kind of left out that we had discussed prior to email and things like that we didn't touch on?
well, I have something that I think is kind of interesting. That's along the lines of what we've been talking about. So if you don't mind, I mean, do you
Absolutely.
have another couple minutes?
Absolutely.
Um, so uh, like we said at the beginning, I used to work in this computational neuroscience lab, and the professor, he's relatively prolific by academic standards, and one of the papers that he published recently um, uh, is sort of quietly is called "How to Never Be Wrong," and it's this brilliant paper that pretty much explains for me most of most everything that's like worth knowing about how humans come to believe things. Like I said, this is something that I covered in that newsletter that
Yeah.
I was talking about. So I think it's interesting people to be able to have some sort of contact with this. But I described the basic idea in another article that I wrote for Scientific American called "How Wrong Should You Be?" And
Yep.
the premise of that one was that so if you if you look at school, right? If you're a straight A student, then one thing that that can mean is that you never challenge yourself enough to do something that you weren't going to be able to do, right? You didn't actually push your limits.
Right.
And the other side, if you're always failing everything, well, you're not learning enough to like do a good enough job, right? So but there's presumably somewhere in the middle where you're really challenging yourself to do something that's truly difficult for you, and uh, you know, that's how wrong you should be. And there's actually interesting AI work on how wrong should your AI models be when they're trying to like learn and do tests and make estimates. Actually, 85% is the number that they came out
Yeah.
with. So,
Yeah, but sure, if it's
so if you want
100%,
something to
then
shoot,
it's not learning. It's not seeing
it's
data
not
that it
learning.
didn't understand. Right. Right.
It's not learning. It already knew the stuff. You're not showing it the right things, or it's not something's going wrong, but
Right.
it's not learning.
Right.
And so I think that's an argument for all of us B students out there. But anyway, what Sam wrote about is that basically, like we were saying earlier, people don't believe things for argumentative reasons, and they don't go through the argument structure in their mind and be like, well, here's this, therefore that, right? And um, another way to conceptualize the way people believe is that, and there's a lot of technical terminology which is kind of hard to get around, but the basic idea is that you have core beliefs, and then you have sort of auxiliary beliefs, is the way he puts it in the paper, which are things that you're happy to concede or let go of if you learn a new fact that contradicts the core belief. You have this protective belt of auxiliary beliefs, which you can always be like, okay, well now, so the example that I give in the paper is that, so if you're a Christian and you are now faced with this, like, the evidence, like, okay, well, the world's like, it's older than 4,000 years, okay? Right. And your core belief is that God created the world. But one of your auxiliary beliefs is that in the Genesis account of creation, an auxiliary belief is that a day is 24 hours long, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if God hasn't created the world yet, there's no reason a day has to be 24 hours long. It could be, 13.7 billion years or whatever.
Right.
And so you can do away with the auxiliary belief that when Genesis says God did this in a day, that a day means 24 hours. And so that way you don't have to discard the core belief that God created the earth, even though you have all this evolutionary evidence, which is not necessary, which is contradicting your earlier theory, right?
Right. Yep.
And so the interesting thing is once you sort of start thinking of beliefs in this way, then you can start thinking a lot about how people come to believe what they believe, why they don't respond in the face of contrary evidence in the way that you think they might, and also how to begin to change their big things, which might basically, one of them is that you in order to get to the sort of core beliefs, you have to chip away at the protective belt over time, little by little by little by little. That's the only way to get there. So there is no one big definitive argument that you can present at a dinner party and be like, okay, well, this is the problem with this, and then have someone disbelieve whatever they thought.
That's not what That's not what 30-year-old Vinny would have said.
Yeah. So anyway, that's something that I've come across recently that I think is relevant to the stuff that we've talked about here. That kind of ties together a lot of, okay, well, you have disagreement, you have beliefs, you have how what do you hold core? What are the the sort of things that are out there that are protecting that in this inferential way. So
No, I think you said it kind of in a joking way, but it's said, it's praise to us B students out there. I think there's something to be said about that. Right? If you're straight A's and whatever, and perhaps you're not, it's too easy, right? If you're a D and F, maybe it's too hard. You're not learning enough to actually move forward. But if you're working your butt off and you're constantly getting B pluses, maybe that is the sweet spot, because
totally.
that.
There's this
Amazing,
idea in
yeah.
psychology of the zone of proximal development, which is just hard enough to push you to do it, but not so easy that you're already, able to do all of it. So it's kind of, it's an argument in the similar vein as that.
Yeah, I've heard that. The quote. I don't know if it was a quote you just quoted. Was it the zone of proximal development? I've heard that in the sales context, in people's sales quotas. If you're hitting your quota every year, then your quota wasn't high enough. If you're coming nowhere near your quota, then your quota is out of control. But if you're
Totally.
just under
Comes
it,
back to expectations,
right?
right?
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And there's arguments saying, well, if you hit your quota every year, then you're not trying, and you're not actually pushing yourself, and you're just making cushy quotas. Should a company reward that? Or should you be, and if you're 40% of your quota, you're not doing it either. But if you're 85 to 90, maybe that's, I think that scales. I think that B student model scales for sure.
I think one of the reasons that the B student thing is important is because it often implies that you're trying things in a different domain than what you've normally done.
Right.
So people usually they might have a proclivity for like language, English, that sort of stuff. They might be good at math, whatever it is. But then if you're to put, the math major in an English class, if you put the English, major in a math class,
Hmm.
then they're not going to do as well.
Right.
And it's not a function of how intelligent they are. It's a matter of them trying to do something that's not currently within their wheelhouse. But of course, we're never going to get new things in our wheelhouse unless we go out there and try them, right? Take a class in economics,
Right.
take a class in computer programming, right? And so when you start to think about things in that way, as uh, you know, then it starts to make sense of why you would want to get less than perfect
Yeah, you
perfect
would
grades.
never learn anything, right? And you would, I mean, that's why I'm a big fan of failing often, failing fast, failing often. I mean, it's just then then you start failing less at something, and the next, you're relatively competent at it. Then you jump to the next thing and fail often, and then next, it's the really only way. If you stood within your
Yeah,
sweet spot, for all things, you'd be really, really good and competent in one area, but then that's where it would end. And I don't think you'd be much,
yeah,
Well, Cody, let me I'll just thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. This was awesome. I have a
cool,
list of like 40 ideas here for as you were talking for future podcasts. So I'm hoping you'd be game to them. I'll hit you up over email after this. Hopefully
awesome.
you're willing to do it. But thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Vinny. This was really great.
And that is it. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time. This is Vinny on Latchmind.